Gary Bauer. I'm a wildlife veterinarian up in Tabazimbi in the Limpopo province. The practice is called Gondwana Wildlife Services, and we run exclusively care and treatment and management of South Africa's wildlife, mostly in privately owned land, but sometimes in the provincial and national parks. And then as a bit of a background, I had an eye clinic for animals for 18 years, so I've got a bit of an interest still in ophthalmology and do quite a bit of work on eye cases in wildlife that I get consulted for. Sure. Well, the most obvious one is that you can't walk up to a lion and say, "Please sit still, let me have a look at your eye." So probably the most important thing is that you don't get the benefit of having an accurate history or reporting by the owner like you would do for a cat or a dog or a horse. And that you rely on examining the eye at the time of immobilization and when you can actually get to the animal and have a look. So from the examination point of view, that poses a whole scenario of difficulties that you don't have in domestic animals. Following that, once you've examined it and you know what to do and you know what the treatment is to give, all your traditional ocular medications, 80% of them are in the form of drops. It can't be used at all in wildlife. So we rely on other formulations and other treatment modalities to be able to treat whatever it is that we're going to be treating. Okay, black rhino have got to be one of my two favorite animals to work on, them and leopards. But it was a very interesting bit of clinical observations. I wouldn't really call it research that we did. One of our national parks, one of our leading national parks, had a black rhino bull that was blind, and he was walking into things and falling into culverts and riverines and stuff like that. So we were called in to examine him. He was already placed into a boma when I got there. So we did have the benefit of being able to observe him and have a look at him, confirmed that he was blind, examined his eyes, and we did a whole lot of tests, including ultrasonography on there, and he was blind. He had retinal detachments in both eyes, basically end-stage ocular disease. We saw him once all the acute disease had healed, and he was at the end stage. And we didn't really know what the cause had been. We suspected that it might have been either infectious or trauma, with the two eyes having been affected a couple of months apart, not both at the same time. And we left it at that. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, the rangers on the reserve noticed another black rhino bull also with an eye problem, and then another 2 more after that they picked up. And that immediately raised the concern that we were worried that it could have been something that was contagious and a new infection that had maybe been introduced and was affecting these animals to the extent that they became visually compromised and blind. And then that led to us actually doing a bit of a study or an examination on these other free-roaming black rhino in the reserve on the bulls. And we found very similar findings, but not as severe, not as bad as in the initial bull that we'd seen. And fortunately, we're able to put the cause down to trauma rather than an infectious or contagious agent. So it was easy to manage that, because the trauma was obviously because of the density of the black rhino bulls in the reserve, and we carried on with the examinations, tried to get them to minimize that spatial trauma and interaction and stress. And I think that the 3 bulls that we examined, we managed to restore the vision to the one that was quite badly affected. The other 2 were okay. And the initial bull that we looked at, he's now living in a controlled environment with 1 or 2 cows, and he's quite happy, although he's completely blind. So previously, the immobilization drug regimens that we used resulted in a fairly fast knockdown of these animals and an immobilization, to the extent that you could only examine them when they were lying down. There have been a couple of developments in some of the products and combinations or different combinations, where we're now able to examine these animals whilst they're still standing, so we can still assess some of the neurological reflexes, which you can't do once they're completely immobilized. And VTech has been at the forefront of compounding those medications into number one, into concentrations, and number two, into formulations that can be used on these mega herbivores, black rhino for example, with relative ease and relatively small dart volumes and inoculations. Free-roaming mega herbivores, or actually free-roaming any wildlife, ocular treatments and managements are always a huge problem, and trying to get the medications in and at a therapeutic index for long enough to allow the eyes, in this particular case, to heal. And there are a couple of formulations that are provided by VTech, which on the one hand provide for long-term tranquilization or sedation. So if they do go into Bauer's for an extended period of time, the anxiety levels and the stress levels are reduced. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it are the compounded medications that we use to actually treat the conditions, either by injectable or via food applications where they get spread over the food that they get to be able to ingest it that way, as well as those that we provide by what we call a remote drug delivery system, so a dart out of a dart gun, which will then eventually fall out and doesn't have to be physically taken out. But VTech does have formulations in those three categories of drugs which really help, and probably the most important are the anxiolytic or the sedatives that we use for when we put them into Bauer's.